In this tutorial, we are going to take a look at how we can create a MySQL database on AWS. And to create the MySQL database, we are going to use the Amazon RDS or Relational Database Service. So you can find the RDS service under Database, and you can click on the hyperlink into that service, and that'll take you into the dashboard for the RDS console. And Amazon's relational database service is designed to make it easy, as it mentions, for you to set up, operate, and scale relational databases in the cloud. And so it has a lot of features on it that Amazon will do some of the administration pieces for you. They'll do some of the database backups and management so that you can focus on your applications and on your data itself. And so you still have some administrative things that you have to do. You still have some ability to connect to servers and things like that, which we will demonstrate in the tutorial. But you can offload some of the typical DBA tasks that you might have to do with a database that you are running, either managing yourself on an EC2 instance or that you might be familiar with in your data center environment. And so RDS allows you to choose from a number of popular relational database management systems, so Oracle, SQL Server, MySQL, a lot of these different platforms that you might already be familiar with. You can use this service to build a similar type of database package on AWS as well. You don't have to. You could install your own MySQL instance on an EC2 instance and manage it yourself, but you get some benefits from using the RDS service. So let's take a look at how quickly and easily it is that you can get started creating a database and how you would go about connecting to it so that you can start importing data and working with that database. So you just want to click on the Get Started if this is your first time into RDS, and that'll take you into the dashboard where you can choose the type of package you want to create. And so we want to stick within the free tier, so make sure you check the box for free tier eligibility only. For some of you, the free tier eligible checkbox could be down at the bottom depending on the region that you're in. So for this tutorial, we're going to launch a MySQL database, but you can see you have a number of different database packages to choose from. Amazon has its own database package. You have MySQL, MariaDB, Oracle, SQL Server, a host of other popular database packages that you could create as well. But for this tutorial, we're going to select MySQL. And we're just going to select the MySQL Community Edition. And that will bring us to the screen where we need to put in our database details. And so within the free tier, we're going to be restricted on some of the options that we have for creating these RDS databases. We're going to use the general public license model. We can keep the database engine as is, but you do have your choice of database engine that you want to choose from. We have just the T2 Micro as at our choice under the free tier that we can choose. But if we were outside of the free tier, we could choose an instance class that is most suitable for the size and the compute power that we think we might need to power our database sufficiently. We also do not have the option to change the storage type or to choose whether or not we want this database to be multi-availability zone deployment. And so if we did have this option, Amazon would create a standby database for us in a different availability zone that we could use to increase the fault tolerance of our database. But for now, we're going to leave these things as is. We'll leave the storage at 20 gigabytes. What we have to do is we have to fill in some informational settings for our database. So we have to give our database an identifier, and this is going to be a name that's unique for all database instances owned by our AWS account in this region. So we can just give it any kind of name for now. And we can give it a master username. This is going to be the username that you are going to use to log into your database. And you also need a master password, and this is also going to be the password that you use to log into your database as well. So when we get to our SQL client that we use to log in with, we are going to need to enter whatever we put in for master username and password. So you may want to just take note of that, or write it down somewhere so that you can make sure that you have it accurately handy for when you get ready to type that information into our SQL Workbench client that we're going to use to connect. So we can just click on next, and then this is where we get to choose the network and subnets and availability zones that we want to launch our database in. We can leave most of these at the default. If you still have your default VPC and you haven't deleted that, we can just launch this database in all of the defaults. And so we can set these up. We can set it to create a new security group. And then we want to just give the database a name. And we can leave the defaults in for the database port that we're going to connect over, and the default parameter and options groups. We don't need any kind of identity and access management, authentication, or encryption for this particular database. Down below is where you can set up the time windows that you want Amazon to do your backups and any kind of maintenance and patching that they may need to do for this particular database. And so we can set the backup retention period. So anything from 0 to 35 days is what we can choose for backup retention. And then we can also choose the window of time for when we want the backup to occur. So if we know that we have very little database operations happening from 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. in the morning, well, maybe we might want to set some preference up around that for our maintenance and backup. So once we have these values in place, we can go ahead and launch our database, and that'll kick off the process to create the database. And so it's going to take a little while for this database to create. We're going to have to wait until the database is actually available before we will be able to connect to it. So right now we can see our database is still in the process of creating. And so once that status goes from creating to available, Amazon will give us the endpoint information that we will need in our SQL client. And the one that we're going to use is MySQL Workbench. This is the client. So if you don't have this already onto your laptop or desktop or whatever you're doing to use this tutorial, you can use any MySQL client that you want, but if you want to download a free one, you can head over to MySQL Workbench, and you can download the version that maps and correlates to the operating system that you're working with, and then come back over and we'll do the connect part once our database is up and available. Okay, so now our database is in the available status, and so that means that we can now connect to it. Amazon has provisioned an endpoint for our database that we can use to connect to that database. And so what we essentially have to do at this point, what we've done is just created the infrastructure for our database. So Amazon has basically kicked off an instance, and they have installed the MySQL database management system on it and configured it, but it's up to us now to connect to that instance, and then we would ultimately have to do all of the normal DBA tasks of importing users, creating data, and setting up the database to our liking. And so we're going to actually just go as far as connecting to the database, because once you're actually out on the database with your SQL client, then the process becomes the same as every other database that's sitting within your on-premise environment. So if you know how to work with a MySQL database after that point, then the rest will look familiar to you. And so the things that we need to grab, we mentioned earlier, we have to have that master username that we selected. So hopefully you made a note of that somewhere. And then you need that master password. And then the third thing we need is this endpoint that Amazon has provisioned for our database. So all the way up to the .com. So basically this URL here, and then we're going to be connecting over port 3306, and that's going to be already configured in our MySQL client. So what you want to do if you've decided to download MySQL Workbench, you want to go ahead and bring that up, and then we will establish a connection to this newly created database that we have in our AWS console. So if you're on the welcome page to MySQL Workbench, you really just need to click on the plus sign so we can add a new connection up. You want to give the connection a name, and you want to fill in the host name. So I'm going to fill in the host name with that endpoint, so that URL endpoint that once our database became available, Amazon provisioned for us. And then you can see we have port 3306 is what we're going to be connecting over. We do want to put that username in, so whatever you chose for username, you want to put that in, and then we can put in our password, and we can click on Store in Vault. So whatever you put in for that password for that master username is what you want to put in here as well. And you can hit OK. And so once you have all of the information in place, you can hit OK, and that will save your connection. And you can go back and you can launch this connection with all of your connections to open up. And once MySQL Workbench or whatever your SQL client is makes a connection or establishes a connection to your AWS database, it will bring up the SQL connection editor so you can start working with your database. And so you can see right now we are now connected onto our database. So we have to then, it's basically essentially an empty database at this point, but we have all of the regular tools that we would typically use to start to build out our database. We can run our queries and work with our database essentially after we build it out. So we can start setting up our users, we can start importing data and doing all the necessary things, setting up the schema, doing everything that's necessary to get our database up and running as we would normally do outside of an AWS environment. So you can see that Amazon makes it easy for us when we're using RDS. They take a lot of the administrative burden out of the process for us. And so some of the benefits you get with using RDS versus your own EC2 instance, Amazon will install the database management system for you, number one. Two, they will do the nightly backups of your data. They will retain those backups for whatever time period you specified. And then three, they will also do some of the administration around any kind of patching to the database management system that you need. And then finally, they have features on there for that multi-availability zone setup where you can have a master slave type of setup where Amazon will manage the replication for you of a standby database and another availability zone within that region. So it kind of removes the need for you to also set up and manage replication within the region at the availability zone level when you're using RDS as well. And then there's a whole host of other features. We can almost do an entire class or course around RDS, but these are just some of the general features that make RDS an attractive option. It allows you to be able to seamlessly replicate a database environment that you already might be using on-prem. So if you're using something like Oracle or SQL Server or MySQL, you can easily import, migrate, and replicate that same environment onto AWS.